Good evening and welcome to District Reports. I'm your host, Eve Galanter, and today our topic is the city assessment process. And we've brought two experts to answer, I hope, some of the questions that you have, because they're some of the questions that I've always had. They are Michelle Drea, the interim city assessor, and Scott West, the lead commercial appraiser with a long history in the assessor's office of residential appraising as well. So welcome to you both.
Thank you.
Michelle, you are the interim city assessor. You came to us from
The State Department of Revenue. So I was the editor for the Wisconsin Property Assessment Manual. I'm an attorney with I have an emphasis in property tax in my background. So when Mark Hansen, the former assessor, retired, I came over to fill in his shoes.
and to basically apply all the technical information of which you seem to have accumulated a great deal to the everyday administration of the assessor's office.
Correct. So I'm kind of going from the big picture to sort of a macro to a micro level, applying it. So it's really been interesting. 1 month on the job. So
okay. Can you even remember how many employees there are in the assessor's office?
I can tell you because I met each of them.
How many
and when
are
I went there? 24. 24.
Seems right.
Yeah, it's about right. And we just hired a few new hourlies, which was really exciting for us in the summertime to do assessment technician work.
And are they sort of evenly divided between, and do they have to have special expertise for residential versus commercial?
Yep, you'd start with residential, and we have a larger staff for residential, just numbers, sheer volume, and then the commercial staff is smaller, but that's more of an expertise where you'd move into commercial from residential.
Okay. This year, I recall, there was a hue and cry from hotel owners about assessments that spiked that appeared to be beyond an increase in resident occupancy at the hotels. Was that expected by your office?
We were anticipating doing a reevaluation of hotels at the time.
Did the people who received the information about the increase know that we were planning to do an evaluation, a revaluation?
I believe they were informed. I actually wasn't involved in that part of it, so I'm not sure about that part. I don't know if you know anything about it. So I can't really answer that, but as far as typically when we do a reval, the people that we're focusing on would be notified. We do that with residential neighborhoods. We'll let everybody know, hey, we're doing a reval. We're going to come out and take a look at your house. So anticipate us, you contact us, and we're going to come through. So with hotels, I'm assuming they were contacted. But
in the newspaper, in the media generally, they seemed quite surprised.
Yeah.
It may have been the amounts, and then they went through a process. But let's back up a little bit. Each of us, homeowners, individual property owners, receives once a year now a little white postcard. It used to be, back when I was on the city council, people only got a postcard when there was going to be a change in their assessment, and now we're sending them out every year. Was that to correct any sort of sense of, was there a mistake or something, people not being certain whether their assessment had changed, that we were now sending it all the time? Or statutorily, do we have to?
Our previous assessor actually made that decision that we would start sending notices to all property owners.
Right.
I think statutorily we're not required to, if there's not a change in your assessment, we weren't required to, but I think it was more of a public service that we provided.
It's a courtesy.
Courtesy that we would provide notices to everybody. So, because we would get calls, I never received a notice in the mail. What's going on? Well, your assessment didn't change. Well, how am I supposed to know that if you don't?
Right.
So I think it was more of a public service why we started doing it to everybody. I think when we weren't doing that, it was more of a cost savings because it costs obviously additional funds to send out notices to people that the assessments didn't change.
Right.
And then after reviewing it, taking a second look at it, I think the assessor decided that it was best that everybody received a notice.
Without having to wonder, did I just not get it, or do I not have a change?
Exactly.
Okay.
So.
And as I recall, when I was on the council, that time period when the postcards arrived, you sort of steeled yourself for phone calls from people saying, "What do you mean? I haven't done a thing to my house, but my neighbor, let me tell you what my neighbor has done." I'm sure you've heard many stories, and you will hear a few, more than a few coming up. After you get the postcard, you know the postcards are going out. You and your staff know the postcards are going out. What do you do to prepare for the phone calls? And what is the most common phone call that you might receive, and how do you address it?
Well, typically we have all of our market data already put together because that's what helped us determine the changes. So we've created different types of spreadsheets and stuff. So if someone calls and says, "Why did my house go up 20% or whatever," an extreme example, we can go, "Well, it was based on sales in your neighborhood, and you live in a ranch house, for example." And we can look up all the ranch houses in a neighborhood and say, "Here's the range of sales of homes similar to yours that sold, and your assessment falls hopefully in line with those sales," and then they'll come back with either it's a condition issue maybe or something like that, and then we'll go from there in the conversation. But typically it's, "Why did we go up so much? I didn't see anything selling in my neighborhood." And then we can point out, "Well, yes, there were this many sales in your neighborhood."
And how are you defining neighborhood? Is it in a different way that I might define, the 3 or 4 blocks around my house as my neighborhood?
We divide the city up into what's called assessment areas.
Okay.
And we've established our own boundaries. They are kind of neighborhood, like Nokoma's for a good example. We actually have the old plats of the Nokoma, the original, and that's how we established that boundary for that. Some neighborhoods aren't as defined by plats, and so we kind of have established based on market data. They sell the same. We may include, have.
So are they approximately geographically, that is in terms of the amount of miles or blocks included, are they all the same, or?
No, some are larger than others. We have 110, 111 residential assessment areas.
So it's less about geography and more about consistency within whatever parameters you're deciding. So when you're looking at what sorts of homes are within that parameter, the sales price, how are they selling, how often are they selling?
Similar housing stocks.
So there's a lot that goes into that calculation.
Okay. And that can be done and is done primarily without actually visiting the house in most instances.
We do a mass appraisal approach, correct. We do try to inspect all the sales because those are the key to what triggers a market change. So we do try to request inspections of homes that have sold in neighborhoods so we can get the information, make sure our building records are correct.
What if I paid $75,000 for a house and you came and looked at it and said, "Sorry, this house we're assessing it at $68,500.
Well, the statutes state best indicator of market value is a recent arm's length sale of a home, but it has to conform with other sales of similar homes.
Okay.
So if you got a good deal on the home, let's say you have a ranch home and you paid $75,000, but every other ranch home around you, similar to yours, sells for $120,000. Something's going on there, obviously, and it doesn't conform with all the other.
So, but then does my house get assessed at $75,000, or is it brought up to the majority of the area?
We would have to interview you, the buyer, and say why, find out the circumstances behind the sale. So maybe it's a condition issue. The basement's a indoor pool now, or there's other issues that maybe it's just a really bad condition house that warrants that price at this point.
That would be a trigger to ask more questions about the
Right.
data. So that would be an indicator that, we need to take a look at this because it's not conforming.
How often is there a requirement about the frequency with which you reevaluate?
The state standard is once every 5 years for revaluation, but Madison is so dense, we're in a constant state of revaluation. So we're always looking in depth at our areas. Much like Milwaukee's the same. Those are the two municipalities in the state that are on the same schedule.
And when you say on a schedule, if my house was never, or not, at least in the last decade, nobody called to say we're coming to inspect your house, would that be unusual?
It can happen, you know, with mass appraisal, you know, within the area, you're looking at the sales and then you're trending wherever that area is. So it could happen that you wouldn't, if the property didn't sell, we would be looking at it from that perspective. But I don't know how common it would be for that length of time.
Have you looked at the asking price versus the assessed value and then the actual sale price? How frequently do they actually coincide?
The asking price doesn't come into play that frequently. We're looking at the final sale price, and we use that compared to our assessment, and that gives us a ratio.
And do our realtors and the public generally, do they call or do they come in to look at the assessed valuation, or now they can look online before they buy, when they're thinking of buying a house, to see, oh, they're asking this amount and the assessed value is either so much lower or so much higher. And when they have questions like that, how can you respond to them? Why would there be a great variance between?
I've actually had those conversations when I was in residential with taxpayers or potential buyers of homes, and I've always told them what they have to keep in mind is our assessments are based as of January 1st of each year, and our assessments are based on a market that's already happened. So for instance, we just finished our January 1, 2018 assessment cycle, but that was based on a market that happened in 2017. And you know, in the real estate market, especially in Madison, how crazy it is. That market is constantly changing. So our assessment's essentially a year behind what the market's doing. So looking at our assessment isn't really going to give you a good indicator of what the current market is, because you know the supply is low right now. So right now, when a house goes on the market, I don't know, you know, how much you've paid attention to that, but there's multiple bids, and that price keeps going up. You know, so we always have to keep in mind that our assessments are basically behind what's really going on. You know, so we gather all the data that happens and then adjust our assessments, even though, you know, right now going into February, where we're at now, I mean, obviously now we have sales that are showing even higher than what we just assessed these homes at. So it's a constantly moving target that we're trying to keep up with.
Right.
So,
as someone who's very interested in this, I do read the property transactions that are printed published in the newspapers. Is that a mandate that the property transactions be published? Is that something that came from the city or the state? I mean, it's fascinating. You know, it's both for viewers who don't follow it, and it's very small print, but it gives the address and the square foot and the year it was built and from whom to whom and the price.
So those must be the real estate transfers?
It's called property transactions.
So I would assume that there's a statute that anytime there's something published in a paper, it's due to a statute.
Okay, so are you feeding that information?
That would be the state.
That was coming from the state.
And those would be, I'm assuming those are based upon real estate transfers. Anytime real estate is transferred, there's a fee involved. And that goes through the state, and that would trigger that information flow.
So that fee that is paid, the real estate fee, does not come to the city?
It trickles down somehow. I don't know the exact nature of it's dispersed. It's a little more technical than what I know off the top of my head. But it does come back to the community somehow.
Right.
I just couldn't tell you precisely how.
Can you recall in the most recent year that you focused on residential, the number of appeals? Do you all track them? Do you create a pool and say, let's figure out and guess how many appeals we're going to get this year?
we actually do have assessment pools that everybody just guessed how many, you know, we have.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
And the winner is actually the loser because they just buy donuts for the office.
Okay. Do you recall the last time?
Oh, jeez. Well, I've been in commercial for 12, 13 years of my 27, so When I was in residential, we actually had a larger volume because we were actually seeing even bigger market increases. I had the near west side when I was an residential appraiser, and we were seeing 15 to 20% increases on a yearly basis. So we were getting upwards of, I don't know, 2,000 appeals or maybe a year.
Okay. If I decide, based on the postcard I get and my phone conversation, that I'm going to appeal, tell a little bit about that process. What would happen next? I notify you that I intend to appeal. Can I do that verbally? Do I have to do that in writing?
You would call our office.
Right.
You have the option to either speak to an appraiser or not speak to an appraiser. It depends on what mood you're in that day, apparently.
Right.
You know.
We always encourage people to chat
Right.
with us, though.
So if you decide to speak to me, for example, I would explain to you how the assessment change came about. You know, talk about sales, and you say, well, I don't agree with it. I want to appeal my assessment. Fine. I would send you or email you, somehow get you the form, objection form that you would fill out, and then you would return the form to us timely, that Michelle was just stuck at the time period. Then what happens is each appraiser has a workload of appeals to deal with over the summer. I would contact you over the summer and say, now this is where the new law changed that shows the Dover case. I don't know if you've heard about that, where that's a whole nother tangent. But anyway, I would contact you and ask to go through your property to make sure our property record is correct. I would come out and go through, and if you have any additional information you want to provide me at that time, you could give me that. Then what I do is I take that information and I would do basically an individual private appraisal almost. Okay, I'm looking at your house specifically now, and I'm doing a market comparison. So I would go and find homes that have sold that are as close to your home as possible, make adjustments to those sales to make them even more comparable to your house. So condition, let's say your house isn't in as good a condition as the other one. Anyway, make all those adjustments, and then we come up with a range of value. Then we see, is your assessment in line with that? If it is, we sustain the assessment.
Right.
If it's not, if it's high or low, we adjust it accordingly. Then if you don't agree with that, you can go on to the Board of Assessors.
Ah, okay.
Board of Assessors is a board of other appraisers in our office, including the assessor. They review my recommendation, and then they vote on it. You're notified of that. If you don't agree with it, then you go to the Board of Review. That's where you can come in as a taxpayer and state your case to the board, and we state our case.
And how many, or with what frequency, are those decisions overturned by the time you get to a Board of Review?
Well, we don't get that many that go to Board of Review typically.
Okay.
Usually it's settled before we get to that.
And I should say, not a lot of municipalities have boards of assessors, but they're very useful.
Yeah.
They allow you to do a lot of research and interaction with homeowners, which is it's a great opportunity to get it right before you would get to something that can be contentious like the Board of Review.
And you're also getting other appraisers looking at it too, giving their opinion. Well, maybe you should have looked at it this, or maybe this comp was better or something, you know, you're getting a bunch of different people looking at it, different sets of eyes.
We have used, both of you have used, and I in the past have used interchangeably, appraisal and assessment. They're not quite the same because, for example, a bank will make an appraisal and a determination based on that appraisal as to how much you can borrow to buy that property. Does it almost always comport with the assessment, or is that a totally different process?
It's different. I'd say similar
Well,
factors.
private appraisals are of a specific assessment date too, kind of like ours, but ours is always as of January 1st. You know, a private appraisal can be whenever, and whatever the purpose of that private appraisal is too. Is it to make a sale go through, or is it for a refinance? You know, it's the same concept, if that's what you're asking.
The same data is used.
Yeah, I mean, they look at other sales and they make adjustments just like we do, and they come up with a value. So it is the same methodology, essentially. So just different purposes.
With what frequency do people call to say, I'm thinking of selling my house, and I don't think this assessment adequately reflects the value of my house.
I've had those conversations too.
And what do you do about that? It's sort of the reverse of
So well, we,
the
typically
complaint.
say, well, the first step would be we need to come out and look at, because typically they'll say, well, I've done this to the house, I've remodeled my kitchen, I've done this, and you don't have that on your record. Well, if no permit was pulled.
I was going to say, excuse me, did you forget to get a building permit?
So we would say, well, we need to look at the house and
Yeah.
come out and take a look at it. And if there are things that we feel add value to your home, we could take another look at it and adjust it. It depends on the time of the year too, obviously. Like we can't in the middle of the summer just all of a sudden adjust your assessment because you want to sell the house.
Right.
So it's always as of January 1st, and I always have to remind people that.
As soon as... Sorry, go ahead.
I typically tell people, going back to your question a while back about people looking at assessments to
Right.
determine whether the house is worth what it is.
Right.
I said typically people don't look at the assessments for that purpose, to judge whether the house is worth that or more.
I was going to ask you about about that, but we'll come back to it. So the appeals process. Oh, I know. I was going to ask about the building permit. As soon as a building permit is issued, does that information come then from the building inspection to your office to say, flag, something good is happening here, and this house may be going up in value, even though the neighborhood in which it sits might not be.
We receive the permits from building inspection on a monthly basis, and we're fielding those. Our staff is fielding those as soon as we get them, essentially. So we're sending out letters for interior inspections. If you remodeled your kitchen, we would send you a card saying, hey, we'd like to get through to look at your remodeled kitchen, or an addition, for instance. We're also sending people out to measure new decks, additions, porches, that type of stuff to make sure, because that's one of our duties as assessors, is to have an accurate building record of every property in the municipality.
Discover, list, and value. Statutorily, that's our duty, is to make sure that we're capturing everything in the municipality.
As you begin your at least your interim status, and we hope your future full status as city assessor, do you have any plans for changes or a vision of how the office might operate any differently than it currently does?
Well, one of the things I'll say is I also live in Madison, and we're very lucky. Our assessor's office, in my experience at the state, I can say this, we have a fantastic crew. So there isn't a whole lot I would change. We're pretty lucky. I would say that I think we could work on a continuing aspect would be public outreach. I think education is really important. People will never be excited about paying property taxes, but we can make it less painful if we can explain how important it is and how fair it is. And so I feel like that's incumbent upon us to do consistent outreach. I love this opportunity today to do that, and I would love to continue that in the different alder districts and chatting with alders and their constituents.
Do you think the alders fully understand all of what goes into the final product in order to be able to discuss it with their constituents? I know I used to say, I think you ought to call the assessor's office.
It's a very complicated area. I don't think in discussing it so that a layperson can understand it is a challenge. So I would say that's where our office and our staff can come in and assist with those conversations, and that is a critical aspect of our role.
I do recall, and I think this is something that most people would probably say, which is, I recall calling and saying, excuse me, but I got this postcard. And have you been in my house? Because no, I don't think you have. But the people are so nice and so understanding and anticipating my phone call. That I think it's something that we should feel very good about. It's not your decision how much taxes that person is going to pay based on that assessment. That's beyond your control. The assessments, are done as professionally as possible, and then the decisions about how that translates into property tax dollars is very different.
It is, and we try to get it right and be as transparent as possible. So that's our goal, and to educate and chat with people as often as they want to.
So the message is call us.
Absolutely.
I think it's important that the taxpayers pay attention to some of the litigation that's out there with like commercial, the dark stores, and I'm sure people have read that in the paper, because that's all comes into effect of how the allocation of the tax.
The dark store?
Dark store theory, it's what a lot of lawyers are using that represent like Best Buys or the Walgreens and those, and they say, well, you should be comparing us to vacant buildings instead of occupied buildings.
Deflating their tax burden, but that
Yeah.
increases
Right.
others' tax burdens, right?
In
The
order to
residential,
meet the
levy.
budget.
Yeah.
And it's boring reading, but I think that's something that the public should really pay attention to, because that does affect the allocation, how that is, because more of that burden is shifted to the homeowner versus the commercial property owners. So I think that's something important that people should really pay attention to.
And just go back to where we began with regard to the hotels, where you talked about you were planning to do a reevaluation, and did it have to do with occupancy? What was it that triggered your expectation that you would do a revaluation? And we have just a little less than a minute left.
So I wasn't involved in the initial revaluation of hotels,
Okay.
But usually what triggers that is market data that we receive. So sales, in the case of commercial, we can look at capitalization rates, vacancy rates, like you mentioned, room rates, all that, and look at it all as a whole package and seeing, okay, what was going on here? Hey, it looks like we need to look at this closer. So.
Well, thank you so much for helping to educate all of us, really, a little bit about the process, and that the public, all of our viewers are welcome to call, speak to Michelle, speak to Scott. Thank you for being our guest today.
Thank you. We do have a great website to check out too.
And what would that be?
It's just on the City of Madison's page, and you can click on the Assessor's office, and there's all kinds of helpful links and resources.
Wonderful. Stay tuned for tonight's City Council meeting. See if buffered bike lanes on Winnebago Street go through, or if there will be a reconsideration of a rezoning on Johnson Street. For that and lots of other things. And then we'll see you again next time on District Reports. Thanks very much.